The autumn sun cast long shadows across Washington Square Park in New York City. Golden light filtered through the turning leaves, illuminating the iconic arch and the steady flow of students, tourists, and locals moving through the urban oasis. Near the southwest corner of the park, a small cafe buzzed with the quiet energy of afternoon conversations. Two men sat across from each other at a weathered wooden table. They appeared strikingly different, one with a stern, weathered face framed by thinning white hair, dressed in a traditional dark suit that seemed slightly out of place in modern America. The other with intense eyes and a lit cigarette perpetually dangling from his lips, wearing a black turtleneck that had become something of a personal uniform. Martin Heidegger stirred his black coffee methodically, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid as if it contained the essence of being itself. Jean-Paul Sartre adjusted his thick glasses, scanning the busy cafe with a restless energy that contrasted sharply with his companion's measured stillness. "Strange to find ourselves here, is it not?" Heidegger finally spoke, his German accent coloring his careful English. "Two European philosophers meeting in New York City, decades after our most significant works were published." Sartre exhaled a cloud of smoke and leaned forward. "Perhaps not so strange. America has always been fascinated by European thought, even as it develops its own philosophical traditions. Besides, is this not the perfect setting to discuss existence? A place where people believe so strongly in reinvention and possibility?" The narrator's voice continues. Neither man had expected this encounter. Their philosophical differences had kept them intellectually opposed for decades. Heidegger, the German thinker whose work on being had revolutionized 20th century philosophy, sat across from Sartre, the French existentialist who had placed human freedom at the center of his thinking. Though they had drawn from similar wells, they had arrived at profoundly different conclusions about the nature of human existence. "I have read your work, Sartre," Heidegger said, his tone measured, but with an underlying firmness. "Your emphasis on radical freedom misses something essential about Dasein, about being in the world." Sartre's eyes narrowed slightly. "And I have studied yours, Heidegger. Your fixation on being obscures the fundamental truth that existence precedes essence. We are condemned to freedom, whether we acknowledge it or not." A server approached with fresh coffee, momentarily interrupting the brewing philosophical tension. Around them, New Yorkers continued their daily routines, unaware that two of the 20th century's most influential thinkers were about to engage in a profound debate about the very nature of human existence. "Perhaps we should clarify our positions," Heidegger suggested, his hands folded carefully on the table. "What is at stake here is nothing less than how we understand what it means to be human." Sartre nodded, extinguishing his cigarette and immediately reaching for another. "Indeed. So let us begin with the fundamental question. Is human existence fundamentally about being, as you claim, or about freedom, as I maintain?" The afternoon light began to shift, casting longer shadows across their table. The stage was set for a philosophical confrontation that would touch on the deepest questions of human existence, all taking place in a bustling New York cafe, where life itself continued to unfold around them in all its complexity. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon crowd thinned out. A gentle rain had begun to fall outside, droplets streaming down the large windows and creating a natural boundary between the philosophical sanctuary inside and the hurried world beyond. Heidegger gazed thoughtfully at the rain before turning his attention back to his French counterpart. "To understand my position, Sartre, we must first clear away the metaphysical debris that has accumulated over centuries of Western thought," Heidegger began, his voice low but commanding. "The question of being, what I call the ontological question, has been forgotten, obscured by our focus on particular beings rather than being itself." Sartre listened intently, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Go on," he said, his skepticism evident but his curiosity genuine. "What I call Dasein, human existence, is unique because it is the only being that questions its own being," Heidegger continued, warming to his subject. "We are not simply present like objects. We exist in a state of concernful engagement with the world around us." The German philosopher picked up his coffee cup, holding it before them. "This cup, for instance. The traditional approach would analyze its properties, its substance, but in everyday life we encounter it as something to be used, as part of a referential totality of equipment. It reveals itself in its readiness to hand, not as an isolated object. So we define things by their utility," Sartre interjected, his French accent becoming more pronounced as he engaged. "That seems to reduce the world to mere functionality." Heidegger shook his head slowly. "Not utility in a narrow sense. Rather, things show themselves through our concerned involvement with them. The cup participates in the act of drinking, which relates to the practice of meeting for conversation, which itself is embedded in our cultural forms of life. Outside, a taxi honked loudly, and both philosophers glanced toward the window before returning to their increasingly animated discussion. The crucial point, Heidegger pressed on, is that Dasein always already finds itself thrown into a world of meaning, a historical and cultural context it did not choose. We are always already situated, always already engaged in practices and relationships that precede our explicit awareness. Sartre frowned, lighting another cigarette. This thrownness, as you call it, doesn't it undermine the freedom that is essential to human existence? On the contrary, Heidegger replied, leaning forward, it is precisely because we are thrown into a world not of our making that authentic existence becomes possible. Authenticity emerges when we resolutely face our finitude, our being towards death, and take responsibility for our possibilities within the horizons of our historical situation. The cafe had grown darker as evening approached. The server quietly placed a small candle on their table, illuminating the two philosophers' faces with a warm, flickering light. But this authenticity you speak of, Sartre countered, seems constrained by factors beyond our control. History, culture, tradition. Where is the space for radical freedom in your account? Heidegger's expression remained impassive, but his eyes revealed a deeper engagement. Freedom is not an absence of constraints, Sartre. True freedom emerges in the recognition of our finitude, in the resolute acceptance of our being towards death. It is found not in escaping our situation, but in authentically claiming it as our own. As he spoke, Heidegger gestured to the rain-soaked city beyond the window. Look at this American city, so different from our European homes. Yet even here, human beings are engaged in the same fundamental project of making sense of their existence within the horizons opened by their historical and cultural situation. But this is precisely where we differ, Sartre said, his voice rising slightly with passion. For you, being seems to have priority over the individual's freedom to choose. And that is where I must fundamentally disagree. The evening had fully settled over New York City. Through the cafe windows, streetlights illuminated the rain-slicked pavements where hurried pedestrians navigated with umbrellas tilted against the persistent drizzle. Inside, the warm glow of candles and subdued lighting created an intimate atmosphere, as if the cafe itself had contracted to focus attention on the philosophical battle unfolding at the corner table. Sartre leaned forward, his eyes intense behind his thick glasses. The ashtray before him already contained several cigarette butts, physical evidence of the conversation's duration and intensity. Your account, Heidegger, while profound, still misses what is most fundamental about human existence, Sartre began, his voice carrying the confidence of deep conviction. You speak of thrownness and historicity, but these are secondary to the radical freedom that defines us. Heidegger raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing his counterpart to develop his position. When I say existence precedes essence, I mean something quite specific, Sartre continued, gesturing emphatically. There is no predetermined human nature, no cosmic blueprint for what we should become. We simply exist first, and then, through our choices, we define ourselves. A server approached to clear away their empty cups, momentarily pausing their exchange. When she departed, Sartre resumed with renewed vigor. Consider any person walking past this window, he said, gesturing toward a young woman hurrying through the rain. She exists without any predetermined essence. Whatever she becomes will be the result of her choices, her projects, her engagements in the world. She is, as we all are, condemned to freedom. Heidegger's brow furrowed. Condemned? An interesting choice of words. You make freedom sound like a burden rather than a gift. Precisely, Sartre exclaimed, striking the table lightly with his palm. Freedom is a burden, because it comes with complete responsibility. With no God, no human nature, no deterministic forces to blame, we bear the full weight of our choices. This is the source of the anguish that characterizes authentic human existence. Sartre reached for his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. Take this cafe where we sit. I could choose to leave right now, to walk out that door, and never continue this conversation. Nothing prevents me except my own choice to stay. And in staying, I am choosing not just this moment, but contributing to the ongoing project of defining who I am. But surely, Heidegger interjected, you do not make these choices in a vacuum. You are situated in a historical moment, in a cultural context, with a personal history that shapes the horizon of your possibilities. Of course, Sartre conceded, But these factors do not determine my choices. They are simply the situation in which I exercise my freedom. Bad faith, what I consider the primary form of inauthenticity, is precisely the attempt to deny this freedom by claiming that one's choices are determined by external factors. The French philosopher lit another cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his intense expression. A worker might say, "I had no choice but to take this job because of my economic situation." But this is bad faith. Even in the most constrained circumstances, one chooses how to respond, how to interpret one's situation, what meaning to give to one's life. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows. The sound formed a rhythmic backdrop to Sartre's impassioned exposition. Your notion of authenticity, Heidegger, emphasizes accepting one's historical situation. Mine emphasizes recognizing that even this acceptance is a choice for which we bear complete responsibility. The recognition of absolute freedom is terrifying. It induces what I call nausea, but it is the precondition for authentic existence. Sartre paused, observing Heidegger's thoughtful expression. In America, perhaps more than anywhere, we see this philosophy in action. The American dream itself is built on the idea that one can reinvent oneself, that one's past does not determine one's future. It is an intuitive understanding that existence precedes essence. Heidegger nodded slowly, acknowledging the point while formulating his response. Your position is powerful, Sartre, but I wonder if this absolute freedom you describe is itself an illusion, perhaps the final illusion of the metaphysical tradition I have sought to overcome. The cafe had nearly emptied now, with only a few patrons remaining at distant tables. The rain outside had intensified into a proper storm, sheets of water cascading down the windows and blurring the city lights beyond. The manager had discreetly informed them that closing time was approaching, but upon recognizing the intensity of their discussion, had offered them another hour, a small concession to the gravity of the philosophical exchange unfolding under his roof. Heidegger's posture had changed subtly as the evening progressed. He leaned forward now, his typical reserve giving way to a more engaged, almost combative stance. Your conception of radical freedom, Sartre, while compelling, fails to acknowledge the full weight of our historical embeddedness, Heidegger said, his German accent more pronounced with his growing animation. We do not first exist as blank slates who then choose our essence. We awaken to existence already immersed in a world of meaning, language, and practices that shape how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. Sartre shook his head emphatically. But that is precisely where you miss the radical nature of human freedom. Even our relationship to this thrownness, as you call it, is chosen. We choose how to interpret our past, how to relate to our cultural inheritance. The past has no power over us except the power we choose to give it. Their voices had risen slightly, drawing a curious glance from the remaining patrons. Both philosophers seemed oblivious to their surroundings now, fully absorbed in the clash of worldviews. Consider technology, Heidegger countered, gesturing toward a customer typing on a laptop at a distant table. Modern technology is not simply a tool we use, it is a mode of revealing that transforms how being itself appears to us. It frames the natural world as a standing reserve of resources to be optimized and exploited. This technological enframing shapes our understanding in ways that precede our explicit choices. Even there we choose how to relate to technology, Sartre insisted. Some embrace it uncritically, others resist it, still others transform it. The meaning of technology in our lives is not predetermined. A flash of lightning illuminated the cafe briefly, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to underscore the philosophical tension. You speak as if the individual stands sovereign, creating meaning ex nihilo, Heidegger said, his tone sharpening. But meaning emerges from our participation in shared practices, languages, and historical worlds that transcend individual choice. Your radical individualism is itself a product of modern metaphysics, not its overcoming. Sartre's eyes flashed behind his glasses. And your emphasis on being risks obscuring the concrete reality of human choice and responsibility. In Nazi Germany, many claimed they were simply following the movement of history, fulfilling their historical destiny. Was this not an abdication of the freedom and responsibility that defines human existence? The reference hung in the air between them, charged with personal and historical weight. Heidegger's brief but significant association with the Nazi Party remained a shadow over his philosophical legacy, and both men knew it. After a tense moment, Heidegger spoke quietly. That is precisely why the question of authenticity is crucial. Authentic existence involves recognizing one's thrownness while taking responsibility for one's historical situation. It means resisting the anonymous conformity of what I call das Man, the they-self. On this perhaps we find some common ground, Sartre acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. Both of us reject the inauthentic existence where one simply conforms to social expectations without questioning. Both of us call for a kind of awakening to the truth of human existence. Outside, the storm continued unabated, mirroring the philosophical turbulence within. The two men regarded each other with a mixture of intellectual opposition and growing mutual respect. Perhaps the question is not whether existence is about being or freedom, Heidegger suggested, but how these two aspects relate to one another in the concrete reality of human life. Sartre considered this for a moment. An interesting proposition. Let us explore it further. Dawn was breaking over New York City. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a freshly washed world glistening in the early morning light. The cafe had long since closed, but the owner, moved by the historical significance of hosting two philosophical giants, had allowed them to continue their conversation through the night, occasionally bringing fresh coffee and discreetly withdrawing. Both philosophers showed signs of exhaustion, Heidegger's posture less rigid than usual, Sartre's eyes reddened behind his glasses, yet they remained animated by the intellectual journey they had undertaken together. "It seems to me," Heidegger said, his voice hoarse from hours of discourse, "that our positions, while different in emphasis, are not as diametrically opposed as they first appeared." Sartre nodded slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Perhaps we have been circling around the same fundamental insights, approaching them from different directions." The morning light cast long shadows across their table, which was now cluttered with coffee cups, ashtrays, and hastily scribbled notes on napkins, physical evidence of their philosophical labor. "Your emphasis on freedom," Heidegger acknowledged, highlights something essential about Dasein that my own analysis perhaps understates. The human being is indeed unique in its ability to question and choose its way of being. And your analysis of being in the world, Sartre responded, provides a necessary corrective to any abstract notion of freedom floating detached from concrete historical situations. Freedom is always situated freedom. A young couple entered the cafe for an early breakfast, glancing curiously at the two intense-looking older men deep in conversation. Outside, New York City was awakening, the streets gradually filling with people beginning their daily routines. "What strikes me," Heidegger continued, gesturing toward the awakening city beyond the window, "is how each of these people will move through their day largely unaware of the fundamental questions of existence that have occupied us through the night. They are absorbed in what I call average everydayness." Sartre followed his gaze. "Yes, but even in this everydayness, they are making choices that define who they are becoming. The office worker who secretly dreams of being a painter but continues in his secure job is choosing a particular way of being, even if he denies this choice to himself. And this choice takes place within a horizon of possibilities, opened by their historical situation," Heidegger added. "The painter's choice has a different meaning in 21st century America than it would have had in medieval Europe." The morning sun now fully illuminated the cafe, bringing their night-long conversation into a new light, literally and figuratively. "Perhaps what we are circling around," Sartre suggested, lighting what he had promised himself would be his final cigarette, "is that human existence involves both the thrownness you emphasize and the freedom I emphasize. We are thrown into a world not of our choosing, yet within that world we still face the necessity of choice." Heidegger nodded, a rare smile softening his austere features. "Existence is neither pure being nor pure freedom, but the tension between these aspects, the dynamic interplay of finding ourselves already in a world while projecting ourselves toward future possibilities." The cafe had begun to fill with morning customers. Life continued around them. Ordinary people engaged in ordinary activities, each living out the philosophical truths that Heidegger and Sartre had spent the night articulating. "In the end," Sartre said, extinguishing his cigarette, "perhaps existence is about becoming, the ongoing process of making ourselves within the situations we encounter. A becoming that is grounded in being," Heidegger qualified, "in the opening or clearing where beings can appear and have meaning for us." They fell silent for a moment, both recognizing that their night-long debate had not yielded a clear victor, but had instead revealed a deeper truth, that existence is too complex, too multifaceted to be reduced to any single principle. "It seems fitting that we had this conversation in America," Heidegger observed, "a nation founded on both inherited traditions and the freedom to reinvent oneself." Sartre nodded in agreement. "A place where being and becoming, tradition and innovation, are held in productive tension." As they finally prepared to depart, Exhausted but intellectually enlivened, both philosophers understood that their debate would continue, not just between them, but in the ongoing human struggle to understand existence itself. The question of whether existence is fundamentally about being or freedom remained open, not because they had failed to resolve it, but because human existence itself continually unfolds at the intersection of these two fundamental aspects of our reality. The morning light streamed through the cafe windows, illuminating two tired but fulfilled philosophers and a world continuing to exist, both being and becoming, regardless of how we choose to understand it.